I mean, it's the most fun I've had with a character I probably will ever have. Not at all. Yeah, no, he has zero empathy.
We're gonna go on a mission right now. So will you come with me?
And it exhausted me to the bone. At the end of the day, I couldn't move, I couldn't talk. Warner Brothers in DC, I'm sure they have like hitmen, wait, like they've tapped this room, and if I say anything, they'll just shoot me when I leave.
In January 2008, the world lost one of Hollywood's brightest stars. He was only 28 years old, but what made the tragedy even more haunting was what came before it.
Hello.
Because just months earlier, Heath Ledger had delivered a performance so disturbing, so intense, that people began wondering whether the role had consumed him.
I mean, you'll just have to wait and see, I guess. I mean, it's the most fun I've had with a character I probably will ever have.
The Joker will become legendary, but behind the makeup, behind the applause, and behind one of the greatest performances in film history was a man quietly falling apart. This is the tragic story of Heath Ledger.
Yeah.
Before Hollywood knew his name, before the awards, before Gotham City, Heath Ledger was just a kid growing up in Perth, Australia.
We're gonna go on a mission right now.
Born in 1979, Heath Andrew Ledger spent much of his childhood surrounded by creativity. He loved storytelling. He loved performing. And even from a young age, there was something intense about him, something different. Friends described him as energetic, curious, and deeply imaginative.
So will you come with me?
But there was also a quietness to Heath, a kind of emotional depth that people noticed long before he ever stepped onto a movie set. His parents separated when he was still young, and while Heath rarely spoke publicly about the emotional impact it had on him, many believe it shaped the sensitive, restless personality he carried throughout his life.
Oh. You will.
As a teenager, Heath became obsessed with acting. Not fame, not becoming a celebrity. Acting. He wasn't chasing attention. He was chasing meaning. While many young actors dreamed of becoming stars, Heath dreamed of becoming great.
There are a few more surprises to him, which
When he was just 17 years old, he left school early and traveled across Australia with friends, determined to build a career in film. It was a massive risk. He had no guarantees, no Hollywood connections, no roadmap, just ambition, and an almost dangerous belief in himself.
I don't know what I'm allowed to say. Like, I feel it's such a Warner Brothers in DC, I'm sure they have like hitmen, wait, like they've tapped this room, and if I say anything, they'll just shoot me when I leave.
Small television roles soon followed, and before long, casting directors began noticing something unusual about the young Australian actor. He had charisma, but unlike many rising stars of the late 90s, Heath didn't feel manufactured. He felt real, raw, unpredictable, and that authenticity would eventually make Hollywood fall in love with him. But it would also become part of what destroyed him, because the deeper Heath disappeared into his performances, the harder it became for him to separate himself from the characters he played. And soon, Hollywood was calling.
And the movie itself, I think, is far exceeding my expectations.
By the late 1990s, Heath Ledger had arrived in America, young, unknown, and thousands of miles from home. Hollywood was filled with actors trying to become stars.
I guess so. Clockwork Orange was a very early starting point for both Chris and I.
But Heath carried himself differently. He wasn't polished. He wasn't carefully media trained. There was something rough around the edges about him, something authentic that casting directors couldn't ignore. And it didn't take long before Hollywood noticed.
It was an exhausting process. Like, I actually had quite a bit of time off in between scenes, but like weeks sometimes. But it was required.
In 1999, Heath landed the role that would introduce him to the world. 10 Things I Hate About You. The film became a massive success. Almost overnight, Heath transformed into one of Hollywood's newest young heartthrobs. Magazine covers followed.
Because whenever I was working, and it exhausted me to the bone.
But behind the attention and rising popularity, Heath was already becoming frustrated because Hollywood had decided who he was supposed to be. the handsome young actor, the romantic lead, the next teen idol, and Heath hated it. While studios saw a marketable face, Heath saw something far more dangerous. A trap he feared becoming predictable, replaceable, forgettable.
At the end of the day, I couldn't move, I couldn't talk, I was just absolutely wrecked.
So instead of chasing easy fame, Heath began making choices that confused people around him. He turned down major roles, avoided playing safe characters, and deliberately moved away from mainstream Hollywood expectations. It was risky. For many young actors, fame becomes addictive, but Heath seemed almost uncomfortable with it.
Wrecked, and if I had to do that every day, I couldn't have done what I did.
He wanted respect more than popularity, and that hunger slowly began pushing him toward darker, more emotionally demanding roles. Films like Monsters Ball and The Patriot showed glimpses of his talent. But it became increasingly clear that Heath wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity. He wanted to become an artist. And the deeper he fell into that pursuit, the more isolated he became from the version of fame Hollywood tried to build around him.
I would have had to have done a milder version of it. But the schedule really permitted me to just exhaust myself.
Friends and directors often describe Heath as intensely focused, restless, always searching for something deeper inside his performances. He wasn't satisfied with simply acting. He wanted truth, real emotion, real pain, real humanity. And over time, that emotional intensity started becoming both his greatest gift and his greatest danger. Because while the world was falling in love with Heath Ledger, Heath himself seemed to be drifting further and further inward, and soon he would take on the role that changed everything forever. By the early 2000s, Heath Ledger was no longer just a rising actor. He was becoming one of the most respected young talents in Hollywood. But for Heath, success was never enough. He wasn't interested in being famous. He wanted to become unforgettable. While many actors carefully protected their image, Heath seemed willing to disappear completely into the characters he played. And with every new role, the performances became more emotionally intense, more personal, more consuming. Then in 2005, everything changed. He starred alongside Jake Gyllenhaal in Brokeback Mountain, a film that would completely transform the way Hollywood viewed him. The performance was quiet, restrained, heartbreaking, and critics were stunned. Suddenly, the young actor once dismissed as a teen heartthrob was being called one of the greatest actors of his generation. Heath received his first Academy Award nomination at just 26 years old. But behind the praise and growing respect, something else was happening. Heath was becoming obsessed with authenticity. Directors who worked with him often described the same thing. He didn't simply perform emotions. He absorbed them. Heath believed great acting required complete honesty, complete vulnerability, and sometimes complete emotional surrender. He isolated himself while preparing for roles. He studied people obsessively. He pushed himself mentally to reach emotional places most actors avoided. And the more praise he received for those performances, the further he pushed himself. By this point, Heath had also become a father. In 2005, he and actress Michelle Williams welcomed their daughter, Matilda. Friends said becoming a father deeply changed him. For a while, he'd appeared genuinely happy, grounded, peaceful even, but balancing fatherhood, relationships, fame, and artistic obsession slowly became difficult. Behind the scenes, Heath's personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. Long filming schedules, constant travel, emotional exhaustion, and through it all, Heath kept searching for the next great performance, the next role, the next transformation. Because for Heath Ledger, acting had become more than a career. It had become an escape. And soon, that search for greatness would lead him toward the role that would define his legacy forever, the Joker. In 2006, director Christopher Nolan made a decision that shocked Hollywood. He cast Heath Ledger as the Joker in The Dark Knight. Almost immediately, backlash exploded online. Fans were furious. To many people, Heath was still the actor from romantic dramas and teen movies. They couldn't imagine him playing one of the most dangerous villains in comic book history. Some called it a disaster before filming had even begun. But Heath didn't respond publicly. Instead, he disappeared into the role. For weeks, Heath isolated himself inside a small hotel room in London, alone, cut off from the world. There, he began building the Joker piece by piece. The voice, the laugh, the posture, the psychology. He studied chaos. He studied anarchy. He studied people with disturbed personalities. And according to those close to him, he became completely consumed by the process. He later revealed that he was sleeping only a few hours a night, sometimes barely sleeping at all. His mind wouldn't slow down. Thoughts kept racing. Ideas kept coming. And the darker the character became, the more intense Heath's preparation grew. He even kept a personal Joker diary filled with disturbing images, fragmented thoughts, and inspirations connected to the character. It wasn't just acting anymore. Heath was building a human embodiment of chaos. And somewhere along the way, the line between performance and reality started becoming blurred. When filming finally began, people on set were stunned. This wasn't the Heath Ledger they knew. The Joker felt unpredictable, dangerous, unsettling. Every movement felt real. Every stare felt uncomfortable. Even fellow actors admitted the performance was deeply disturbing to witness in person. But beneath the brilliance of the performance, Heath himself appeared exhausted, emotionally drained. Interviews during this period revealed a man struggling with severe insomnia and mental fatigue. At one point, he'd admitted that his mind simply couldn't stop thinking. He described sleeping only 2 hours a night. And while the world would later romanticize the performance as artistic genius, those closest to him saw something more worrying, a man pushing himself beyond his limits. Because Heath wasn't just trying to play the Joker, he was trying to become him. And the deeper he disappeared into the darkness of the character, the more isolated he became from himself. By 2007, Heath Ledger was carrying the weight of two different worlds. To the public, he was becoming a Hollywood legend, but privately, his life was beginning to unravel. The intense filming of The Dark Knight had left Heath emotionally and physically exhausted. Friends later described him as drained, restless, constantly struggling to sleep. But the pressure surrounding him extended far beyond the Joker role itself. At home, Heath's relationship with Michelle Williams had become increasingly strained. The couple had once appeared deeply connected, grounded by their daughter Matilda, and the quiet life they tried to build away from Hollywood. But fame rarely leaves room for peace. Long filming schedules distance, emotional exhaustion, and constant media attention slowly began creating cracks in the relationship. In 2007, reports confirmed that Heath and Michelle had separated, and according to people close to him, the breakup hit Heath hard, very hard. Friends said he became increasingly isolated. He traveled constantly, slept irregularly, worked obsessively, and despite his growing success, there were signs that Heath was struggling emotionally behind the scenes. Interviews from this period reveal moments of exhaustion hidden beneath his calm personality. His eyes often looked tired, his energy felt scattered, and insomnia that began during the Dark Knight reportedly continued worsening. To cope with the sleepless nights, Heath began relying on prescription medications, sleeping pills, anxiety medication, painkillers. Individually, many of these medications were common, but together, they created a dangerous combination. And perhaps the saddest part of all was how invisible the struggle seemed to the outside world. Because while Heath was quietly falling apart behind closed doors, his career had never looked stronger. Hollywood praised him. Critics admired him. Directors considered him fearless. He was achieving everything he had spent his entire life chasing. Respect, greatness, legacy. Yet somehow, none of it appeared to bring him peace. And as the pressure continued building around him, he drifted further into exhaustion, isolation, and emotional darkness. The world was preparing to witness the performance that would make him immortal. But tragically, Heath Ledger would never live to see it. In January 2008, Heath Ledger was living between worlds, between exhaustion and ambition, between isolation and fame, between survival and collapse. To the public, Heath was still one of Hollywood's brightest stars, but privately, those closest to him were becoming increasingly concerned about his health. He looked tired, very tired. Friends later recalled how he often struggled to sleep properly for days at a time. His body appeared exhausted, but his mind refused to slow down. He continued working relentlessly, even as the physical and emotional pressure surrounding him intensified. In the weeks leading up to his death, Heath had been balancing multiple film projects while traveling constantly between cities. The schedule was brutal, and according to people around him, he seemed emotionally drained. Yet despite the warning signs, life around him continued moving forward. Then came January 22nd, 2008. Inside his apartment in New York City, Heath Ledger was found unresponsive. He was only 28 years old. The news shocked the world instantly. Fans couldn't believe it. Hollywood couldn't believe it. Within hours, headlines spread across the globe. Questions followed immediately. What happened? Was it intentional? Was it connected to the Joker role? Had fame finally consumed him? But the reality was far more tragic and far more human. Investigators later concluded that Heath's death was caused by an accidental overdose involving a combination of prescription medications, sleeping pills, anti-anxiety medication, painkillers, a deadly mixture taken by a man desperately trying to rest. And almost overnight, the story surrounding Heath Ledger transformed into mythology. The Joker performance became surrounded by rumors and speculation. People began connecting the darkness of the character to the tragedy of his death. Some claimed the role had destroyed him. Others believed the obsession had consumed him completely. But those closest to Heath would later push back against that narrative. Because while the Joker role may have intensified an already exhausted mind, the truth was likely more complicated. Heath wasn't destroyed by one single performance. He was a deeply sensitive man carrying enormous pressure, battling exhaustion, insomnia, emotional isolation, and the overwhelming weight of constant expectation. And in the end, one of the most gifted actors of his generation died alone in silence, while the rest of the world still believed he was unstoppable. But the tragedy of Heath Ledger's story wasn't over yet, because just months later, the world would finally see the performance he left behind. In July 2008, just 6 months after Heath Ledger's death, The Dark Knight was finally released, and almost immediately, the world realized they were witnessing something unforgettable. Heath's Joker wasn't just another comic book villain. He felt terrifyingly real, unpredictable, chaotic, completely unhinged. Every scene carried tension. Every movement felt dangerous. Audiences didn't feel like they were watching an actor in makeup. They felt like they were watching pure madness unfold on screen. Critics were stunned by the transformation. The same actor once dismissed as a Hollywood heartthrob had delivered one of the greatest performances in cinematic history. Almost overnight, the backlash surrounding Heath's casting disappeared completely. The doubters became admirers. The critics became believers. And the Joker became legendary. Lines like, "Why so serious?" quickly became iconic across the world. But beneath the praise and celebration surrounding the film, there was also something deeply haunting about watching it, because audiences now viewed every scene through the lens of tragedy. Every laugh, every stare, every moment of chaos carried the shadow of what had happened only months earlier. And for many fans, the performance almost felt painful to watch, not because it wasn't brilliant, but because it was. Heath's Joker didn't feel like a man pretending to lose himself. It felt like someone giving every piece of themselves to the role. The performance quickly became immortalized in film history. Actors praised it, directors studied it, fans obsessed over it. And in 2009, Heath Ledger posthumously won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, as his family stood on stage accepting the Oscar on his behalf. The moment felt both triumphant and heartbreaking. Heath had achieved the greatness he spent his life chasing, but he wasn't there to see it. And perhaps that's what makes his story so tragic. The role that transformed him into a cinematic legend became part of the same story that the world would forever associate with his death. Even today, nearly 2 decades later, Heath Ledger's Joker remains the standard by which all comic book performances are judged, not just because it was shocking, not just because it was dark, but because it felt real, painfully real, and behind that unforgettable smile was a man the world was already beginning to lose. Nearly 2 decades after his death, Heath Ledger remains one of Hollywood's most unforgettable figures, not just because of how he died, but because of what he left behind. Heath represented something rare in modern Hollywood: authenticity. He wasn't carefully manufactured. He wasn't obsessed with celebrity culture, and he never seemed interested in becoming comfortable. Instead, he spent his career chasing truth inside his performances, even when that search demanded pieces of himself in return. That's why audiences connected with him so deeply. Because whether he played a cowboy, a romantic lead, or a psychotic villain, there was always something human underneath the performance, something vulnerable, something real. And after his death, that honesty became part of his legacy. Younger actors began studying his work. Directors praised his fearlessness. Fans revisit his films searching for pieces of the man behind the characters. But perhaps the most haunting part of Heath Ledger's legacy is the question that still lingers around him today. What could he have become? Because at just 28 years old, Heath wasn't slowing down. He was evolving, growing, transforming into one of the defining actors of his generation. And many believe his greatest performances were still ahead of him. Instead, his story became frozen in time, forever tied to youth, brilliance, tragedy, and the Joker. Over the years, countless rumors and myths have surrounded Heath's death. Some people still insist the Joker role destroyed him completely. Others believe the truth was far more complicated. But maybe the real tragedy isn't about one role at all. Maybe it's about what happens when someone spends their entire life chasing greatness without ever truly finding peace. Because beneath the awards, beneath the legendary performances, beneath the fame and mythology, Heath Ledger was still human. A young man carrying pressure the world couldn't see. A father, an artist, a dreamer. And in the end, perhaps that's why his story still resonates so deeply today. The world remembers a Joker, but behind the paint, behind the laughter, and behind one of cinema's greatest performances was a man searching for peace. And maybe that's the real tragedy of Heath Ledger. If there's one thing Heath Ledger's story reminds us, it's that the people who seem the brightest of the world are sometimes fighting battles nobody else can see. Heath gave audiences performances they'll remember forever. But behind the genius was a man carrying exhaustion, pressure, loneliness, and expectations that never seemed to stop. And while the world may forever connect him to the Joker, those closest to him remember something far more important: a father, a friend, an artist who loved deeply and created fearlessly. Heath Ledger's story didn't just leave behind one of the greatest performances in cinema history. It left behind a warning about fame, pressure, and the hidden cost of greatness. And even now, years later, the world still hasn't forgotten him, because legends don't disappear. They echo. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe for more cinematic stories exploring the rise, fall, and legacy of the world's biggest celebrities.